Hey there, friends, and welcome to this episode of SelfKind with me, Erica Webb. We are on episode 201, and in this episode, I'm going to share with you some of the myths that surround self-love and why, in fact, they are myths and not truths. I don't know, myths and truths feels like a hard word to say today, but anyway, we will push on. So we are going to dive into that. All right, so episode 201, and if you tuned in last week to our 200th episode, or any episodes prior to that, thank you so much. Before we dive into today's topic of talking about some of the myths surrounding self-love, I actually want to just touch on something that I mentioned in last week's episode. I'll give you the context for it, so if you're like, I didn't listen, or I haven't listened yet, this makes no sense, I'll make sure I lay the foundations for you. But it's funny, it's something that's popped into my mind repeatedly throughout the week, and so I was like, you know what, I was gonna have to talk about this because it is kind of a bit of an earworm at the moment, and it matters to me to try to create as much clarity as I can, both for myself and of course for those of you listening as well. So last week's episode, I did like a top 20 tips for self-care and kindness and love, and one of the tips that I talked about was using your reaction to other people's self-care habits give you some clues about what you think about self-care, right? So I use the example of, sometimes if I see my husband choosing to rest when I'm in the midst of doing busy work, that it can be really frustrating. And that in that context, it is an interesting thing for me to consider. How does that actually give me information about what I believe about self-care and my worthiness of it, my ability to access it, all of those sorts of things. What I thought on reflection, though, was that sounded very dismissive of the very real problematic issues that we face around division of labor in families. And so I want to address that because it is definitely not how I intended it to be communicated. But when I listened to it, I was like, there's a chance that that's how that's going to be received. And it's sort of an interesting example of like the both and, right? Of yes, we can use this as a interesting little experiment in like, how does this show me some of the things that I might believe about self-care? And also, where is it showing up inequalities? Because here's what I want to say about that. I used my partner, my husband, as an example in that scenario, but our division of household labor is actually pretty devised. Is that a word? Pretty well divided. A few years ago, declared that I was no longer cooking the family meals. And my husband works from home, so that was, a viable handoff, right? Like it wasn't like we were going to have to wait until late in the night to eat if I decided not to cook. But I said, I am at my capacity. My mental load is overflowing. Cooking is the thing that is bringing me the least joy right now, and I need to not do this anymore. And so over the course of, overnight, basically, I stopped cooking and he started. And he cooks all of our meals. He does all of the groceries pretty much, except if I pop in for certain things. And he does other things as well. But they're the two kind of things that I just was like, I'm not doing this anymore. And it has created a sense of division of labor in this house that feels far more equitable than it ever has had prior to that point. Anyway, I wanted to kind of just point that out, not to be like, oh, my husband's so fabulous, although he is wonderful, but also to just point out that it isn't ever as simplistic as a podcast episode or a sound bite or a social media post can encapsulate. And so I know that sometimes I can be very like, oh, well, that message really kind of doesn't capture the whole picture of what it's really like to be a human, right? Which is super nuanced, super complicated, and sometimes very messy. And what I really wanted to make sure in kind of giving you this explanation is that, I want to ensure that I am not coming across, I guess, as sort of complicit in that division of labor being unfairly, laden on one partner. Anyway, hopefully I've done a good job of explaining that. But I think that we can both use these relationships to kind of get some clues of like, what is it that I believe about my ability to access self-care? And there are also some very real realities around your ability to access self-care, depending on the division of labor, depending on whether or not you have children, don't have children, are partnered, not partnered, etc., etc. So I do see the nuance. I do see the much bigger picture. It doesn't make for as fluid a conversation, probably, as you can tell. But like I said, that kept popping into my mind, and I was like, you know what? I'm just going to insert this at the start of this episode because it really matters to me. I am very, very much about as much equality as we can find and manage and create and support. And so I just wanted to make sure that I cleared that up. Nobody said anything to me. Nobody's brought it to my attention, but it was brought to my attention by me and it mattered to me. So hopefully that, if you had that thought, you're like, oh, okay, that makes more sense. So on to today's episode. We are talking about some of the myths of self-love. And there's 3 that I want to go over today. I did do a social media post about this some time ago, but as we know, those posts only last a very short period of time, and I think this gives us a bit more space and a bit more words to dive into some of the nitty-gritty. So 3 myths. I'm going to tell you all of them, and then we're going to go and dig into each of them in turn. So myth number 1 is that when you love yourself, you will always feel loving towards yourself and never experience things like self-doubt, self-criticism, or disappointment in yourself. Number 2, loving yourself means you will be soft on yourself and never push or challenge yourself. And number 3, the best path to self-love is after you've proven that you've earned it. So you've stopped messing up, you're finally getting things right, you no longer disappoint yourself, etc., etc. All of those are myths. But when you hear them, do you kind of get like a spark of, oh, yeah, that's what I've been doing, right? I'm waiting to feel like I love myself. I'm waiting to feel that loving feeling. I'm waiting to be perfect. I'm waiting to whatever. So acknowledge, get curious. Is there something that feels like a grain of truth in there for you? And we're going to talk about why they're all myths, because they are. None of these are true. So number 1, when you love yourself, you will always feel loving towards yourself and never experience self-doubt, self-criticism, disappointment in yourself, etc. We will continue to feel self-doubt, self-criticism. We will continue to disappoint ourselves. We will continue not to measure up to our own standards, probably for a lifetime. And so if we are waiting to have loving feelings towards ourselves at all times in order to say, yes, now I love myself, we are going to be waiting a really long time. I'm not saying that your self-doubt, self-criticism, feelings of disappointment, etc. can't reduce. Of course they can, but it is absolutely part of being human to have those feelings. And so the way that I like to look at this and the way that I like to talk about this is to think about the decision for self-love being the first part. And it doesn't mean that we necessarily make the decision for self-love and then we have all these lovey-dovey feelings towards ourselves. When we think about that word love, often when we embody the feeling of love, we really understand it from the point of view of like what it feels to love someone else or love something else or love another creature, right? Like we understand that feeling of love for our children, our partners. We understand that feeling of love for like our pets. We understand that feeling of love in these other contexts. And I think that sometimes we then expect that feeling to be very much the same, turned inwards, and that it will precede our desire to have a relationship with ourselves that is seen through that lens, right? Because oftentimes, if you sort of think about it like a romantic relationship, we talk about falling in love with each other as though it is a process, which absolutely. And it's sort of like that person is proving their love to us, right? Or proving their ability for us to love them. And so then we might look at it like we need to do the same thing in our relationship with ourselves. Like I need to fall in love with myself the way that I would fall in love with someone else. And we know that process as this process of like proving things over time. But I think that when it comes to self-love, the decision to have that loving relationship with ourselves, it comes first. And then we take actions, we do things, we relate to ourselves in a certain way in order to demonstrate that decision for self-love. And I get that this is a bit of it challenges our way of thinking about this, for sure. Absolutely it does. But I truly think that that decision for self-love comes first. And therefore, you will not always feel loving feelings towards yourself, even if you have made that decision to love yourself, right? I've decided to love myself. Doesn't necessarily mean I'm always going to have loving feelings towards myself. But just because I have feelings that aren't loving also doesn't mean that I have moved away from self-love. Yeah? Myth number 2 is that loving yourself means you'll be soft on yourself and never push or challenge yourself. And I hear this one a lot, particularly around like the subset of self-love that we would call self-kindness. And self-kindness, self-compassion, these things really talk to the fact that we can be loving towards ourselves and kind towards ourselves, even in the midst of discomfort and pain and all of those uncomfortable human emotions. We feel, though, sometimes like to be kind to ourselves, to be compassionate, to be loving towards ourselves will mean that we won't do things that feel hard. Because isn't the kind thing just to take the easy path? In my experience, it is not hard to push yourself with love. It is not hard to challenge yourself with love. Because sometimes you have that capacity to push and challenge because you have that foundation of that decision to love yourself. Because when you've got that sort of stronger self-loving foundation, it's not as scary to take those challenges and to push yourself towards things that you want that perhaps feel a little bit scary. Because you're not dealing with the same attachment to your self-criticism, your self-doubt, your self-judgments. You have this foundation of like, I have decided that I am in a loving relationship with myself, and that loving relationship with myself creates this foundation from which I can then take these challenges, from where I can push myself a little bit. That word push is so often associated with harshness. But we can like push ourselves with love towards something that we want. If we are feeling a little bit nervous about something that is new or something that is different or something that feels a little bit hard, just because we need a little nudge to get moving doesn't mean that we're harming ourselves, right? Doesn't mean that we're punishing ourselves, doesn't mean that we are being harsh towards ourselves. It really depends on the intention and the language and the energy that we bring to that. And so pushing yourself isn't inherently a mean thing, right? Or a thing that requires you to have negative emotions towards yourselves. We can absolutely push and challenge with love. And so I would argue that when we are in a loving relationship with ourselves, we have more capacity for those challenges. We have more capacity for that push than when we are reliant on having that relationship with ourselves that's kind of a little bit like, you know, the really, I don't know if you've ever had a personal trainer who like takes the shouty route, you know, the real kind of like stick, you know, donkey in a stick route of pushing through criticism and loudness and aggression, right? You can push yourself like that if you want to, but I 100% 100% believe that it is more effective when we do it with love. And so no, being loving towards yourself does not mean that you are going to be soft or never take challenges or never push yourself towards things you want. In fact, you might find that it's actually the opposite. And then myth number 3 is that the best path to self-love is that like prove it path, right? Like I have to prove that I am worthy of this love. Much like we might find ourselves falling in love with someone external to us, right? And this is just simply a myth because we won't get to that point where we don't ever mess up, where we don't ever disappoint ourselves, where we don't ever run into our own self-doubt and self-criticism. We can work on loosening their hold. We can work on having the space to see that those things are just thoughts that have very real foundations in the sense of, coming from experiences that we've had and all of that sort of stuff. So not to dismiss it by saying that they're just thoughts, but understanding that we don't have to be controlled by them. But if we believe that we have to earn our own love, that becomes an endless process of trying to prove ourselves. Endless, truly endless. And so much like I said for myth 1, is the decision to love yourself comes first. We can demonstrate our love and kind of prove our love through our actions. And notice that that's different. Proving our love to ourselves through our actions is very different to trying to earn our love through our actions. Very different. So you do not have to get everything right in order to be worthy of your own love. You get to choose to love yourself anyway, right? Get to choose to love yourself first, and then let yourself be that soft place to land when you inevitably face self-criticism, self-doubt, disappointment. Allow yourself to be that place of compassion, that place of kindness, that place of warmth. Is this easy? No. No, but it is 100% your birthright to, have that loving relationship with yourself. You don't have to do anything to prove your worth to yourself. But we come by that very, very honestly, right? I think we've all had experiences with other people where we very much felt like we had to prove our worth, whether it was with a parent or a teacher or a coach or a partner, where we feel like in order for you to continue loving me, I have to prove that I'm worthy of your love. We absolutely have probably all universally experienced that on some level at some point. You do not have to do that for your own relationship with yourself. Even though I know sometimes it feels that way. I know that sometimes those ways we have of relating with other people can make it feel like we also have to do that with our relationship with ourselves. And as I say that, I realize it sounds like I'm saying, but you still have to do it with your relationships with other people. You obviously don't, right? So we kind of intellectually know that we also don't have to earn other people's love, right? We don't have to do things to be worthy of love, but it's not our lived experience for most of us, right? We have so many examples of times where we feel like we have had to earn love. You do not have to prove your worth to yourself in order to choose to love yourself. We can take this in the opposite direction. Choose to love yourself first, and then take loving actions that create more and more evidence for that decision to be loving towards yourself. So those are the 3 myths that I wanted to cover today. And self-love is such an interesting thing because it's not something that we were taught to do, right? We were not taught to love ourselves. I remember being a kid in primary school, particularly. I don't know why it stands out as a primary school age thing so much, but I remember kids like taunting each other. Oh, she loves herself. She loves herself. She's so stuck up. She's up herself. Oh, you just love yourself. Comments like that were so common. So common. And it's no wonder that self-love can feel so hard when it was something that was criticized, to feel proud of yourself, to kind of like say to the world, I did a thing and I'm proud of it. I like my ponytails today. I really love this outfit that I've put time and effort into. I grew up in a time in the 80s and 90s where we were criticized for that by our peers. Not consistently, not always, but absolutely there was that undertone. And so self-love, if it feels foreign, it's with good reason. It's with a history of that not being necessarily supported. I have really tried hard with my own kids to instill that sense of like, you are your own most important relationship. But it's interesting how tricky that is. It is actually really tricky because so much of the time we are working to remain integrated, accepted, loved parts of collectives, right? We want to belong to groups. We want to belong in our family. We want to belong in our relationships. And so we're so used to having this feeling like we have to prove ourselves. Not because necessarily we actually do have to, but there is this drive to remain included, to remain loved, to remain safe in our community, right? In whatever size community we're talking about, whether it's the immediate family unit, whether it's your, anywhere. And so as we've gotten older and we're like, oh, my relationship with myself could do with some work, I think it's just really important to recognize that a lot of this challenge we come by very honestly. We come by very honestly because it wasn't necessarily encouraged or nurtured when we were kids. Yeah. All right. I'm going to leave it there. If you have questions, you can come and find me. I'm at Erica Webb _SelfKind. I would love to hear from you as always. And until next week, keep being kind to yourself, choose love, and I will talk to you then.